The message arrives in Berlin at 0847 hours on a June morning in 1944. It travels through the usual channels, encrypted, decoded, typed onto thin paper and placed in a folder marked Urgent. The folder moves through corridors where men in uniform make decisions that will determine whether soldiers live or die. The message contains specific details: troop concentrations, supply movements, the location of armored divisions preparing for deployment. It names units. It provides numbers. It describes activity observed near embarkation points along the English coast, and it says something else. It says the main thrust will not come at Normandy. The men who read this message do not question its source. They have received hundreds of reports from this agent over the past 3 years. His network spans Britain. His sub-agents report from ports, from military installations, from government offices. His information has proven reliable before. When he warned of a convoy route, the route was later confirmed. When he described defensive preparations, reconnaissance flights observed similar patterns. He has earned his code name. He has earned his salary, paid through clandestine channels into accounts he maintains in neutral countries. He has earned the attention of senior intelligence officers who regard his network as one of their most valuable assets in the Western theater. Now, in the hours after Allied forces have touched Norman beaches, his assessment carries weight. The landing at Normandy is a diversion. The real invasion force waits at Pas-de-Calais. Panzer divisions must not be released to reinforce the Norman coast. They must remain in position to counter the primary assault, which will come within days. The agent is certain. His sources are clear. He has staked his reputation on this assessment. Somewhere in the command structure, a decision crystallizes. Reserves will hold their positions. Tanks that could reach Normandy within hours will wait for an invasion that will never come. Soldiers who might have pushed Allied forces back into the Channel will remain where they are, watching empty water, guarding against phantom armies. The message has done its work. But there is something the men in Berlin do not know. Something about the agent they trust. Something about the network they believe spans Britain. Something about 3 years of reports, hundreds of transmissions, a carefully constructed architecture of intelligence that has shaped their understanding of enemy intentions. The agent is not who they believe him to be. The network does not exist, and the message they are acting upon was written not in some hidden safe house by a loyal operative, but in a London office by men who have spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Every word is a lie. Every detail is designed to deceive, and the consequences of believing it will be measured in divisions held in reserve, in beaches not reinforced, in a foothold that becomes an invasion, that becomes the end of everything the men in Berlin have been fighting for. The agent's name, according to German records, is Arabel. He is their most trusted spy in Britain. He does not exist. The man behind the fiction was born in Barcelona in 1912 into a family that had known both comfort and collapse. His father managed a business that dealt in textiles and dyes. His mother came from a family with modest standing in Catalan society. He grew up in a household that valued education, conversation, and a certain skepticism toward grand ideologies. Later accounts describe him as imaginative even as a child, prone to elaborate games and private theatrics that entertained his siblings. He was not built for warfare. When the Spanish Civil War tore through his country in the 1930s, he found himself trapped between factions he despised equally. The nationalists under Franco represented a brutality he could not stomach. The communist elements among the Republicans seemed to him another form of tyranny wearing different clothes. He was conscripted, he evaded, he hid. He falsified documents to avoid frontline service. This was not cowardice. It was something more complicated, a refusal to kill for causes he did not believe in, a survival instinct wrapped in moral objection, a willingness to deceive authority when authority demanded participation in violence. He emerged from the Civil War with a particular set of skills. He knew how to lie convincingly. He understood that paperwork could be manufactured. He had learned that men in uniform often saw what they expected to see, believed what they wanted to believe. He was slight in build, dark hair, a face that could pass unremarked in a crowd. He spoke Spanish and Catalan fluently, French passably, and fragments of other languages collected from books and films. He had no military training, no intelligence background, no connections to any spy agency. What he had was hatred. The rise of fascism across Europe filled him with a particular kind of rage. He watched Germany's expansion. He heard reports of what was happening in occupied territories. He understood, perhaps earlier than many, that this was not simply another European war, but something different, something that required resistance from anyone capable of offering it. He decided he would become a spy. This was not a realistic ambition. He had no training, no contacts, no way into the closed world of intelligence services. He was a Spanish civilian with a failed business venture behind him and a young family depending on him. The British would have no reason to trust him. The Americans had not yet entered the war, but he had one asset that mattered. He was willing to approach the enemy. His plan, such as it was, relied on a simple principle. If the British would not accept his services, perhaps the Germans would. And if the Germans accepted him, perhaps that acceptance itself could become something useful. He would offer himself to German intelligence as a spy. He would tell them he could travel to Britain and build a network of informants. He would tell them whatever they wanted to hear. And then he would find a way to make that fiction serve the other side. It was an absurd plan. It required the Germans to trust a man who walked in off the street with nothing but ambition and imagination. It required him to sustain a lie indefinitely, with no support, no training, no safety net. It required the British to eventually discover what he was doing and choose to work with him rather than expose him. Any of these requirements failing would mean capture, interrogation, execution. He began anyway. In early 1941, he made contact with German representatives in Madrid. He presented himself as a Spanish businessman with fascist sympathies and useful connections. He told them he had been offered a diplomatic position that would allow him to travel to Britain. He told them he was willing to send back information. The Germans were cautious. They asked questions. They tested his story. They watched him for signs of duplicity. He answered their questions with confidence he did not feel. He manufactured details about his background, his contacts, his access. He played the role of an eager collaborator, a man motivated by ideology and money in equal measure. It took time, but eventually they said yes. If this history matters to you, subscribe so these stories aren't lost. The recruitment process unfolded across several months, in meetings held in Madrid cafes and anonymous offices where men spoke carefully and revealed little. German intelligence in Spain operated through the Abwehr, the military intelligence organization that handled espionage, sabotage, and counterintelligence across occupied and neutral territories. The Abwehr station in Madrid was active, well-funded, and constantly seeking assets who could penetrate the British Isles. Spain's neutrality made it a natural corridor for intelligence work. The man who would become Arabel presented himself as a gift. He claimed connections to Spanish commercial circles with British trade relationships. He described sympathies with the National Socialist cause, though he was careful to frame these sympathies as practical rather than fanatical. He suggested that he could obtain a position that would give him reason to travel to England, and once there he could observe, recruit, and report. The Abwehr, officers who assessed him were not fools. They had seen self-promoters before, men who promised access they did not have, men who wanted money without delivering results, men who talked well but produced nothing. Their vetting procedures, while imperfect, were designed to filter out the obvious frauds. They tested him. They asked detailed questions about his background, his family, his political development. They probed for inconsistencies in his story. They requested documentation. They watched his reactions under pressure, looking for the tells that might indicate deception. He had prepared for this. The lies he told were anchored in partial truths. His family background was real. His business history was verifiable. His movements during the Civil War could be confirmed through public records. The fictional elements, his ideological commitment, his British connections, his access to diplomatic channels, were layered onto this foundation in ways that were difficult to disprove, showed them what they wanted to see. A man of modest standing who had survived turbulent times, a man with practical motivations and realistic ambitions, a man who understood the value of money and the necessity of choosing the winning side, not a zealot who might attract attention, not a professional who might be running a counter-operation, just a useful amateur with opportunity and willingness. The Abwehr agreed to proceed. They provided him with basic training in tradecraft, how to construct coded messages, how to use invisible ink, how to identify information of military value. The training was brief, conducted over several sessions in secure locations. He absorbed what he could, asked questions that suggested enthusiasm rather than expertise, and demonstrated enough competence to satisfy his handlers. They gave him money. This was significant. Intelligence services did not fund operations they did not believe in. The allocation of resources indicated genuine confidence in his potential value. He would receive regular payments through cutouts and neutral country bank arrangements. The amounts were modest by peacetime standards, but substantial enough to sustain a man and his family. They gave him a code name, Arabel, and they gave him a mission: travel to Britain, establish yourself, build a network of sub-agents who can observe military activity, monitor shipping, report on morale and preparations. Send regular reports through the channels we will establish. Prove your value, and your compensation will increase. There was one problem. He could not actually get to Britain. The diplomatic position he had described did not exist. His claims about British visa access were fabrications. He had no way to legally enter the country he was supposed to spy on, but he had told the Germans he could do it. And having told them, he could not admit failure. Admission would mean exposure. Exposure would mean the end of his plan before it truly began. So he did something audacious. He traveled not to Britain, but to Portugal. He settled in Lisbon, where the spy trade flourished under the cover of neutrality, where German and British agents operated in proximity, where information flowed in all directions through diplomatic pouches and commercial channels. And from Lisbon, he began sending reports about Britain, reports about a country he had never visited, describing details he had never witnessed, citing sources he had never met. He would write his way into the enemy's confidence without ever setting foot in enemy territory. The first reports were constructed from fragments: a British tourist guide purchased in a Lisbon bookshop, newsreels shown in Portuguese cinemas, shipping schedules published in newspapers, refugee accounts overheard in cafes where displaced persons gathered to share news from across the continent, magazine articles, radio broadcasts, anything that could be collected, synthesized, and transformed into intelligence. He invented his network. A dock worker in Liverpool who observed convoy preparations, a low-level civil servant in London with access to government correspondence, a businessman who traveled between cities and noted military installations. Each sub-agent had a name, A background, a personality, a reason for cooperating with the German cause. None of them existed. But their reports did. He wrote them carefully, spacing transmissions to suggest operational tempo, varying the sources to create the appearance of a functioning network. He included details that could be verified, shipping movements that aligned with public information, military units whose presence in certain areas was documented in newspapers. He also included errors. This was deliberate. A spy network that never made mistakes would attract suspicion. Real agents working under pressure produced occasional inaccuracies. They misidentified units. They reported rumors alongside facts. They sometimes transmitted old information as if it were current. Arabel's network made similar mistakes. Small ones, plausible ones, errors that suggested human limitation rather than systematic deception. The Germans received these reports through dead drops and courier chains that ran from Lisbon to Madrid to Berlin. They decoded the messages, analyzed the content, and compared it against other intelligence streams. The information checked out. Not perfectly, not always in detail, but frequently enough to suggest genuine access. When Arabel reported a convoy departing from a certain port, German sources sometimes confirmed activity at that port around the reported time. When he described troop concentrations in a particular region, the description aligned with other assessments. What the Germans did not realize was that Arabel was working backward. He identified information that was already public or would become public shortly. He framed observations to be vague enough to match multiple possible outcomes. He timed transmissions so that by the time they reached Berlin, the events described had already occurred in ways that could seem to confirm his accuracy. It was a confidence game dressed as espionage, and it worked. The Abwehr handlers in Madrid expressed satisfaction. They increased his funding. They requested more detailed reports. They provided additional channels for communication. They trusted him enough to ask specific questions, identifying intelligence priorities that told him what they wanted to hear. He gave them what they wanted. Reports about British morale, carefully, calibrated to suggest strain without collapse. Reports about military preparations, detailed enough to seem valuable but vague enough to avoid specific predictions that might fail. Reports about his expanding network, new subagents recruited, new access obtained, new channels established. He was building an empire of fiction, but he was also running out of time. The longer he operated from Lisbon, the greater the risk that someone would notice inconsistencies, that a detail in one of his reports would contradict verifiable fact, that the Germans would ask for something he could not provide, that his elaborate construction would collapse under the weight of its own complexity. And there was another problem. He had approached British intelligence multiple times, offering his services, explaining what he was doing, asking for guidance and support. They had refused him. The British representatives in Lisbon had dismissed his approaches as the fantasies of an amateur, another self-promoter seeking attention or payment. They had not investigated his claims. They had not considered that a man might already be running a deception operation against Germany without their knowledge. So he continued alone, sending reports, inventing sources, managing a network that existed only in his imagination, waiting for someone on the other side to notice what he was doing. The British became aware of Arabel in early 1942, and the discovery came not through his direct approaches, but through signals intelligence. Bletchley Park, the secret installation where British codebreakers worked against German encryption systems, was intercepting and decrypting Abwehr communications. Among the traffic they processed were references to an agent operating in Britain, an agent with the code name Arabel, an agent whose reports were being taken seriously by German intelligence. The problem was that British counterintelligence knew of no such agent. MI5, responsible for domestic security, maintained careful records of suspected German operatives. They tracked surveillance targets, monitored communications, ran double agents who fed controlled information back to Berlin. Their systems were not perfect, but they were thorough enough that an active German spy network operating across multiple British cities should have triggered some form of detection. Arabel's network showed no traces. The sub-agents he claimed to be running did not appear in any surveillance files. The dead drops and communication channels he described did not match any known tradecraft patterns. The locations he cited were real, but the activities he reported did not correlate with MI5 observations. Two possibilities emerged. Either the Germans had succeeded in placing an agent of extraordinary skill who had evaded all British detection for over a year, or the agent did not exist in the form the Germans believed. Investigation leaned toward the second possibility. The reports attributed to Arabel contained errors that a genuine British-based spy would not make, geographic descriptions that seemed derived from maps rather than observation, cultural details that felt slightly wrong as if filtered through secondary sources, timing patterns that suggested the agent was not actually present when events occurred. The conclusion crystallized slowly, confirmed through careful analysis of intercepted traffic. Arabel was real. His network was not. Someone was running a deception operation against German intelligence, and whoever it was, they were not working for Britain. MI5 began searching for him. The trail led backward through communication channels to Lisbon, where the agent's transmissions originated. From there, the trail pointed to a Spanish national who had been approaching British representatives with offers of cooperation that had been dismissed. The man behind Arabel was not a German agent at all. He was an amateur who hated fascism and had invented an entire spy network to damage the German war effort. And he had been doing it alone, without support, without guidance, without any connection to Allied intelligence. The British faced a choice. They could expose him, ending his operation and eliminating the risk that his errors might eventually be discovered by the Germans. They could ignore him, allowing his independent activity to continue with all its inherent dangers, or they could bring him under control, integrating his fictional network into the existing British system of deception and double agents. They chose integration. In early 1942, the man behind Arabel was contacted through secure channels. He was told that the British government was aware of his activities. He was told that his services were now desired. He was told that if he wished to continue, he would do so under British direction. He agreed immediately. He had been waiting for this offer for over a year. Arrangements were made to extract him from Lisbon. Travel documents were prepared. Cover stories were constructed. In April 1942, he arrived in Britain, the country he had claimed to be operating from for months, setting foot on English soil for the first time. He was given a new handler, a new support structure, access to real information that could be woven into his reports. Most importantly, he was given something he had never had before: protection. If the Germans ever grew suspicious, British counterintelligence would provide cover stories, manufacture evidence, create explanations for any inconsistencies. His fictional network would become part of a larger deception apparatus, coordinated with other double agents, integrated into strategic plans. He was no longer alone, but he was also no longer free. Every message now required approval. Every fictional sub-agent had to be documented and tracked. Every claim about British military activity had to be checked against reality and adjusted to serve Allied purposes. The creative improvisation that had sustained him in Lisbon was replaced by structured process. He accepted these constraints. The alternative was exposure, and exposure meant death. For the Germans still believed in Arabel, still trusted his reports. still paid his salary through neutral country accounts. They had no idea that their prized agent now worked for the enemy. The daily routine of deception was exhausting in ways that left no visible marks. He operated from a house in London provided by his handlers, a modest property in a neighborhood where discretion was expected and questions were not asked. His cover identity established him as a minor functionary in a Spanish commercial enterprise, someone with legitimate reason to maintain correspondence abroad, someone whose movements would not attract surveillance. Inside the house, the architecture of his fictional network required constant maintenance. The sub-agents he had invented in Lisbon had to be sustained. Their personalities had to remain consistent across months of reports. Their access had to evolve plausibly as the war situation changed. Their relationships to Arabel had to be managed with the same care a real agent would apply to human sources. He kept files, index cards with names, backgrounds, characteristics, limitations. Notes about what each fictional agent had reported, when and through what channel. Records of payments claimed, operational difficulties encountered, personal circumstances mentioned in passing. The administrative burden of running a fake network approached the complexity of running a real one. British intelligence provided genuine information to seed into his reports. This was the essence of controlled deception. The reports Arabel sent to Germany had to contain real details, verifiable facts that would reinforce his credibility. But the framing of those facts, the conclusions drawn from them, the implications for German planning, these elements were carefully crafted to mislead. A real troop movement might be reported accurately, but attributed to a unit that did not exist. A genuine observation about port activity might be combined with fictional context that suggested preparation for an operation that was not planned. True details surrounded by false interpretation. The Germans received intelligence that felt authentic because much of it was authentic. They trusted Arabel's analysis because his observations proved reliable. They could not know that the reliability was engineered, that the accuracy of details was designed to obscure the inaccuracy of conclusions. The transmission schedule demanded regularity. Reports had to flow at intervals that suggested active collection without overwhelming the system. Too frequent, and the volume might seem implausible. Too sparse, and the Germans might question whether the network remained operational. The timing had to account for fictional travel between cities, for the rhythms of sub-agents who had jobs and families and cover identities of their own. He wrote most of the messages himself. His handlers reviewed and approved them, sometimes adjusting details to align with strategic objectives, but the voice remained his, the personality that the Germans had come to know over months of correspondence. The particular blend of confidence and caution, observation and analysis that characterized Arabel's style. Maintaining that voice under direction was harder than creating it freely had been. In Lisbon, he had invented without constraint. In London, every invention required justification. Why would this sub-agent have access to this information? How would this observation have been made? What operational risks would explain this delay? His handlers were professionals. They asked difficult questions, they challenged assumptions, they demanded consistency, and they watched for signs that he might be playing a longer game. The British could not be entirely certain of his loyalties. He had approached the Germans first, after all. His story about hating fascism might be true, or it might be cover for deeper motivation. Until he proved himself conclusively, some degree of surveillance was inevitable. He knew he was watched, telephone calls monitored, mail examined, visitors noted, not aggressively, not obviously, but persistently. The same protection that shielded him from German discovery also constrained his freedom of action. He accepted this as the cost of the work. The reports continued, week after week, season after season. The fictional network expanded, added sub-agents, developed new sources, reported from new locations. The Germans promoted Arabel within their own assessment hierarchy, rating him as one of their most productive assets in the British theater. They paid him more. They asked him more. They trusted him more. And every transmission brought him closer to the moment when that trust would be exploited for purposes the Germans could not imagine. The first serious suspicion emerged in late 1942, and it came from an unexpected direction. One of Arabel's reports had described convoy activity along a route that subsequent German operations had failed to intercept. The timing had been plausible. The details had seemed specific. But when submarines were dispatched based on the intelligence, they found nothing. Questions were raised. The Abwehr maintained quality control procedures, cross-referencing agent reports against operational outcomes. A single failure meant little. Convoys changed routes. Weather disrupted schedules. Information degraded in transit. But patterns of failure could indicate problems with a source. Arabel's record came under review. His handlers in Madrid received queries from Berlin. How reliable was this agent? What was the basis for confidence in his network? Had there been other instances where his intelligence had not translated into operational success? The review process was not yet accusatory. It was routine diligence, the kind of verification that any professional intelligence service would conduct. But it created danger nonetheless. Detailed scrutiny might reveal inconsistencies that casual oversight had missed. Comparisons across multiple reports might expose patterns that individual messages had concealed. British intelligence learned of the review through intercepted communications. The response had to be calibrated carefully. If Arabel suddenly became more accurate, producing intelligence that led to operational successes, the improvement itself might seem suspicious. Why had his network's quality increased precisely when questions were being asked? The Germans might conclude that the British had discovered their agent and were now feeding him controlled information. If Arabel's accuracy did not improve, the Germans might lose confidence and reduce their reliance on his network, diminishing his value as a deception channel. The solution was indirect. Arabel would acknowledge difficulties. One of his sub-agents, he reported, had become unreliable. The man had personal problems, financial pressures, had begun drinking heavily. His recent reports could not be trusted. Arabel had already reduced contact and was considering terminating the relationship. This fictional explanation served multiple purposes. It accounted for the failed intelligence without implicating Arabel himself. It demonstrated tradecraft awareness, the recognition that human sources degraded over time. It showed the Germans that their agent maintained quality standards, culling underperformers from his network rather than continuing to transmit unreliable information. The explanation was accepted. The review concluded without adverse finding. Arabel's standing remained intact. The unreliable sub-agent was formally dropped from the network, his fictional existence terminated with an appropriate cover story about relocation and loss of contact. But the episode revealed vulnerability. The deception could not proceed indefinitely without friction. The Germans were not credulous fools who would accept everything they received. They analyzed, compared, questioned. They had other sources, other agents, other channels of information about Britain. Inconsistencies between Arabel's reports and those other sources could trigger exactly the kind of scrutiny that had just occurred. British intelligence adjusted their approach. Greater care was taken to align Arabel's reports with information the Germans might receive elsewhere. His claims were calibrated against known German reconnaissance capabilities, against what their other agents might observe, against what neutral sources might report. The goal was not just to mislead, but to mislead consistently, creating a coherent false picture that could survive comparison with other data. The stakes were rising, the war was shifting, Allied planning for major operations was underway, the potential utility of Arabel's channel for strategic deception was becoming clearer, but that utility depended entirely on maintaining German trust. One significant failure could collapse everything, and the closer the deception came to mattering, the more carefully it had to be maintained. The decision that would define everything came in late 1943 as Allied planning coalesced around the invasion of France. Operation Overlord, the cross-channel assault that would open a second front in Western Europe, represented the largest amphibious operation in military history. Its success depended on many factors: weather, tides, logistics, combat effectiveness. But one factor overshadowed the others: surprise. The Germans knew an invasion was coming. The buildup of forces in Britain was impossible to hide. The question was not whether the Allies would attack, but where and when. If German command could predict the landing site accurately, they could concentrate defensive forces at the point of assault. Overwhelming firepower awaited the invasion fleet. Failure was possible. Catastrophic failure, with tens of thousands of casualties and the invasion thrown back into the sea. Allied planners understood this. The solution was deception on a scale never before attempted. Operation Fortitude would convince the Germans that the Normandy landing was a feint, a secondary operation designed to draw reserves away from the real objective. That real objective, according to the deception plan, was Pas-de-Calais, the point on the French coast closest to Britain, the logical site for an amphibious assault, the location the Germans already considered most likely. Fortitude required the Germans to believe in an army that did not exist. The 1st United States Army Group, FUSAG, would be positioned in southeastern England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. It would have divisions, commanders, headquarters, communication traffic. It would conduct exercises, generate supply requests, produce the administrative footprint of a massive military formation preparing for action. None of it was real. Inflatable tanks, plywood aircraft, radio traffic transmitted between empty locations, an elaborate theatrical production designed to be observed by German reconnaissance and reported by German agents. Arabel's network was central to the plan. His fictional sub-agents were positioned to observe FUSAG. His reports would describe troop concentrations, command structures, operational preparations. His analysis would reinforce the conclusion that Pas-de-Calais was the primary target. His credibility, built over 3 years of trusted correspondence, would give weight to the deception. The decision to commit fully to this role could not be undone. If the Germans discovered the deception before or during the invasion, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not only would the element of surprise be lost, but the exposure of Arabel's network would reveal the extent of British deception capabilities. Other double-agent operations would come under suspicion. The entire structure of intelligence warfare might collapse. British intelligence assessed the risk and proceeded. Arabel began reporting on FUSAG in early 1944. His sub-agents described American units arriving in southeastern England. His network observed armored vehicles, artillery concentrations, ammunition stockpiles. His analysis suggested that the force being assembled was larger and more capable than anything positioned near actual embarkation points. The Germans received these reports and integrated them into their strategic picture. FUSAG became real to them, real enough to influence planning, real enough to shape troop deployments, real enough that when the invasion came, it would confirm rather than contradict what Arabel had been telling them. The choice had been made. There was no retreat from this point. No way to walk back the claims, to explain the observations, to disavow the analysis. The deception would either succeed or fail, and either outcome would carry consequences that could not be anticipated or controlled. Arabel continued transmitting. The Germans continued believing, and the date of the invasion drew closer. By May 1944, Arabel was the most valued German intelligence asset in Britain. This was not an assumption. It was documented in intercepted Abwehr communications, confirmed through signals intelligence that British codebreakers processed with particular attention. The Germans rated his network as their primary source of information about Allied invasion preparations. His reports were cited in strategic assessments. His conclusions influenced high-level deliberations. He received the equivalent of a promotion. Additional funding was allocated to support his expanded network. Direct communication channels were established to ensure his reports reached decision-makers without delay. His handlers expressed confidence and satisfaction, commending his work, encouraging continued effort, promising rewards when the war reached its conclusion. The trust was absolute, and the danger had never been greater. The Germans were paying close attention to everything he reported. Any inconsistency now would be scrutinized with far more intensity than before. Any failure of intelligence could trigger the kind of review that had occurred in 1942. But this time, the stakes were incomparably higher. This time, the entire invasion hung on the deception holding together. British intelligence managed every detail with obsessive care. Messages were drafted and redrafted. Timing was calculated to account for fictional transmission delays. Claims were cross-referenced against known German intelligence capabilities to ensure nothing contradicted information they might have obtained elsewhere. Arabel's personal situation added complexity. He was living under sustained pressure, maintaining a fiction that had grown beyond anything he had imagined when he began in Lisbon. His family was with him in London, dependent on him, aware of some version of what he did, but not the full scope. The isolation of deception work, the inability to share the burden with anyone who did not have clearance, the constant awareness that failure meant death, these pressures accumulated without release. Records from the period suggest he managed the strain through compartmentalization. He maintained separate identities in his own mind: the man who lived in the house, the man who wrote to Germany, the man who met with British handlers. Each identity had its own concerns, its own relationships, its own constraints. Keeping them separate required mental discipline that never relaxed. The fictional subagents had to be managed with equal care. By this point, the network had grown to include more than 24 notional sources, each with documented backgrounds, capabilities, and limitations. Some reported frequently. Some were held in reserve for specific purposes. Some had been retired or killed off as operational circumstances required. Each one required maintenance. A subagent who had not reported recently needed explanation: personal illness, travel difficulties, surveillance concerns. The explanations had to be plausible, consistent with the character that had been established, fitting the operational environment that the Germans believed existed. The Germans sometimes asked questions about specific subagents. They wanted additional information on certain topics. They requested that particular sources be tasked with specific observations. These requests had to be answered in ways that maintained credibility while serving deception objectives. Sometimes the answer was yes, the information could be obtained, with appropriate delay for fictional collection and transmission. Sometimes the answer was no, that particular subagent did not have access to that topic, or operational circumstances made the tasking impossible. The negotiation between what the Germans wanted and what British intelligence was willing to provide required constant judgment. Give too much, and the deception might not achieve its objectives. Give too little, and the Germans might grow suspicious. The balance had to be maintained perfectly, day after day, message after message as the invasion approached. The invasion began on June 6, 1944, and Arabel's role entered its most critical phase. Allied forces landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. Airborne divisions dropped behind German lines. Naval bombardment covered the approach of landing craft. Thousands of soldiers fought their way onto French soil in the first hours of what would become the liberation of Western Europe. The Germans responded with the forces available to them, but significant reserves did not move. Panzer divisions positioned to counter the expected main assault remained in place, waiting for the Pas-de-Calais attack that Fusag was supposedly preparing. The decision to hold these forces came from high command, influenced by strategic assessments that gave substantial weight to Arabel's reports. The battle on the beaches hung in the balance through the first day and into the second. German reinforcement could have made the difference. Armor arriving in the beachhead areas could have contested the landing. Zones pushed the Allies back before they could consolidate, turned Normandy into a disaster instead of a victory. The reinforcement did not come. And then Arabel sent his most important message. The timing was precise. The content was calculated. The purpose was to prevent the release of German reserves for as long as possible. His report arrived in the early hours of June 9th, transmitted through emergency channels that had been established for exactly this kind of critical intelligence. It described Fusag preparations reaching final stages. It provided specific details about embarkation activity, about command orders, about the imminent launch of the primary assault. Normandy, the message implied, was the diversion that Arabel had warned about. The real invasion was coming. German command received this assessment and had to decide what to do with it. The source was trusted. The network was valued. The analysis was consistent with what Arabel had been reporting for months. The temptation to move reserves to Normandy was strong, but the risk of being caught off guard at Pas-de-Calais could not be dismissed. The decision was made to wait. Reserves held their positions. Armor that could have reached Normandy remained where it was. The window during which German counterattack might have succeeded closed further with every hour that passed. By the time the Germans finally began releasing forces toward the beachhead, the Allies had established positions that could not be easily dislodged. The consolidation phase had succeeded. The breakout from Normandy became possible. The liberation of France began. None of this was visible to the Germans at the moment of decision. They believed they were exercising prudent caution, maintaining reserves against the primary threat, while the secondary operation at Normandy was contained. They believed their intelligence was sound, their analysis was reasonable, their strategic posture was correct. They believed in Arabel, and that belief cost them the war in the West. The deception held longer than British intelligence had anticipated. Even after weeks of fighting in Normandy, even after the scale and intensity of Allied operations made clear that this was no secondary effort, the Germans continued to credit the possibility of a Pas-de-Calais assault. Fusag remained in their assessments. Arabel's reports continued to be received and analyzed. The fictional army group persisted as a planning factor into July 1944. German divisions that might have reinforced Normandy remained positioned to defend against an invasion that existed only in signals traffic and false reports. The resource allocation decisions made on the basis of Arabel's intelligence had effects that compounded over weeks and months. The agent himself continued transmitting. His handlers maintained the fiction with appropriate adjustments. Fusag's attack was delayed, he reported. Operational difficulties, command disagreements, weather concerns. The explanations fit the pattern of military planning, where timetables slipped and preparations extended beyond initial estimates. The Germans accepted these explanations. Their trust in Arabel remained intact, even as the strategic situation deteriorated. This was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire operation. The source was never exposed during the war. The network was never discovered to be fictional. The elaborate construction of 3 years, hundreds of reports, dozens of invented subagents, an entire architecture of deception remained hidden from German intelligence. Part of this success was due to German organizational failure. The Abwehr was under pressure from multiple directions: internal power struggles, competition with SS intelligence services, the general strain of a war that was going badly. The resources available for thorough vetting of sources were limited. The inclination to question trusted assets was diminished by the need to show results. Part of the success was due to the skill of British management. Every potential contradiction was anticipated and managed. Every inconsistency was explained before it could attract suspicion. The quality of the deception was maintained at the highest standard throughout the most critical period. But part of the success was simply luck. There were moments when discovery was possible, moments when a different question asked, a different comparison made, a different officer assigned to review might have unraveled everything. The margin between success and exposure was narrower than anyone could know at the time. After the war, when captured documents revealed the extent of German reliance on Arabel's network, British intelligence officers expressed surprise at how completely the deception had succeeded. They had hoped to influence some decisions. They had not expected to become the primary basis for German strategic assessment in the Western theater. The consequences were measured in divisions mispositioned, in battles not fought, in a campaign that unfolded differently than it might have. None of this was revealed to the public at the time. The agent returned to private life after the war. He lived quietly, first in Europe, then in South America. The story of what he had done remained classified for decades. The historians who would eventually piece together the full picture worked with limited access, reconstructing events from fragmentary records and aging memories. The Germans never learned what had happened. Many of the officers who had trusted Arabel died in the war or in the immediate aftermath. Those who survived into peacetime did not know they had been deceived. The fiction persisted in their memories as fact. The recognition came from both sides, and the irony of that symmetry was never lost on those who understood what had happened. Germany awarded the Iron Cross to their agent Arabel, a decoration for exceptional service to the Reich. The presentation was handled through intermediaries, the medal and accompanying documentation delivered through channels that preserved operational security. Britain awarded the MBE for services rendered, though the public investiture did not explain the nature of those services. The man who received it stood in the same categories as administrators and civil servants, his unique contribution invisible to anyone outside the classified record. 2 decorations from opposing sides of a world war, both given for the same work. The man who earned them returned to obscurity. He had never sought recognition. His motivation, as best as it can be reconstructed from the limited evidence available, was personal rather than professional. He hated fascism. He wanted to contribute to its defeat. He found a way to do so that matched his peculiar skills and circumstances. The cost of that contribution was borne privately: years of sustained deception, the pressure of maintaining multiple identities, the isolation of work that could never be discussed, the knowledge that failure would mean death, that exposure could come at any moment, that the elaborate construction of his false network depended on perfect execution, maintained indefinitely. The psychological burden left marks that records do not capture. He lived the rest of his life with the knowledge of what he had done and the inability to speak of it fully. His family knew fragments, his friends knew less. The historians who later sought him out received selective accounts shaped by the constraints of classification and the natural erosion of memory. The strategic impact was documented more thoroughly. Analysis after the war concluded that the Normandy deception had shortened the campaign by weeks or months, had reduced Allied casualties by estimates that varied but ran into the thousands, had contributed materially to the success of the liberation of Western Europe. Arabel's network was central to that deception. The fictional sub-agents he had invented in Lisbon in 1941, sustained through years of careful correspondence, integrated into British intelligence operations, and deployed at the decisive moment, these inventions had changed the course of the war. The Germans had trusted a spy for 3 years. Every report was a lie, and the consequences of believing those lies were paid in territory lost, in battles not won, in a campaign that ended in occupation and defeat. The man behind the deception received his medals and returned to private life. He never claimed credit beyond what the records compelled. He never sought to profit from the story. He lived, he aged, he died, and the lie that he had sustained for 3 years outlasted him, preserved in archives and historical accounts. A reminder that the most consequential intelligence operations are often invisible until long after they have achieved their purpose. The Germans never discovered who Arabel really was. They went to their graves believing they had been served by a loyal agent who had done his best under difficult circumstances. The truth was simpler and more devastating. They had been deceived by a man who walked in off the street with nothing but imagination and hatred, who built an empire of fiction from a Lisbon apartment, who sustained that fiction through years of war, and who delivered it to their enemies at the moment it mattered most. The spy they trusted was never theirs at all.